Hi, Mystery Recapped here. Today, I am going to explain a post-apocalyptic drama film called Cargo. Spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. At the start of the film, we are introduced to a couple, Andy and Kay, along with their 1-year-old daughter Rosie, in a world ravaged by a virus that turns people into zombies in 48 hours. They seek refuge on a houseboat in rural Australia. While relocating to a safe space for the night, Andy spots 2 children playing on the riverside. He waves at them and tries to talk with them, but their father spots Andy and draws a revolver from his belt, compelling him to continue on his way. The family is used to getting supplies from the sea, as they are too scared of traveling to the land. Later, Kay mentions that their food supplies are running out and that they should travel through land to get better supplies. However, Andy criticizes her decision, as he is scared of what lies on the land. Afterward, Andy discovers an abandoned sailboat on the riverbank and goes out to inspect it. While he collects some food and a bottle of wine from inside, he hears some strange noises coming from within a door. Despite being curious, Andy is unwilling to take any risks and retreats to his boat. He passes the captured goods over to Kay, but she is skeptical about the food. Being the good husband that he is, Andy manages to convince his wife that everything is fine. Andy probably should have mentioned the zombie sounds he heard, but I guess it's not important. Later, Kay asks Andy to take a break and then heads to the sailboat. The greed to salvage more supplies prompts her to enter the dangerous yacht alone. Andy had left earlier after hearing thuds from a door, but Kay is completely unaware of this. Soon, she gets pulled and bitten by an unknown entity, most likely a zombie. Andy's sleep is disturbed by Rosie's crying, and he goes in search of Kay. He notices some bloodstains on the floor and finds Kay trying to keep blood flow under control. She is inside the restroom and has a bite mark on her knee. She then explores a rucksack that Andy had retrieved from the yacht earlier. Kay wears a bracelet that counts down how much longer an infected has left, as well as an infusion that mitigates the brain and allows an infected to transition into a zombie painlessly. Andy and Kay discuss their objectives, revealing Kay's vulnerabilities to the family. After the emotional discussion, the family finally makes the decision to leave the houseboat and seek medical assistance. In the next scene, Thumi, a little Aboriginal girl, is shown doodling in a sketchbook. After leaving her house, she tosses a dead rabbit into a hole. She suddenly hears gurgling noises and puts her hands over her ears. It seems like she is trying to feed something. Later, Andy and Kay locate a car nearby. They nearly dodge a zombie approaching them as they drive away. After some time driving, they stop the car so that Andy can study a map as Kay starts changing Rosie's diaper. Just then, Kay drops on the floor, vomiting blood all over the place. Andy jumps out of the car and swiftly calms her down. Kay appears to be transforming into a zombie. On the other hand, Thumi can be seen throwing a snake into the hole again, but this time she hears no sound. Elsewhere, Kay regains her consciousness and examines her wound, which is dripping yellow sludge. She screams at Andy as she gets out of the car, outraged that he has been trying to keep her zombie progress secret from her. She's worried about infecting their baby daughter. Despite his concerns, Andy calms her and persuades her to follow him. To prevent Kay from making another escape, he smashes the doorknob. On the way, Andy gets distracted by a weird-looking guy on the road, which results in the car crashing into a tree. Hours later, Andy regains consciousness and tries to wake Kay up, but finds her already turned into a zombie. Her lips and eyes are filled with yellow pus. Andy is frightened and tries to escape with Rosie, but gets bitten by her while attempting to do so. After some attempts, Andy manages to get out of the car and applies one of the injections to Kay. Before setting out towards the destination on foot, he puts Kay's timer bracelet on himself and straps Rosie to his back. The small girl starts crying as she misses her mother, but Andy quickly calms her down by applying Kay's perfume. During a short stop for rest, Andy discovers the person who caused their accident. He identifies him as a zombie and prepares to defend himself. Suddenly, Thumi appears and attempts to distract the zombie guy, who turns out to be her father. She requests that Andy stay away from him and cuts her hand with a rock, which begins to drip blood. This seems to attract her zombie father towards her. After some walking, Andy enters a school and encounters a retired instructor named Etta. She aids him in washing his wounds and informs him that all of the Aboriginal people in the area have left, including many of her former students. She also requests him to spend the night at the school. Later, Andy notices a fire nearby, started by the Aboriginals, and also a woman who is trying to contact Thumi. At night, Andy gets his first seizure because of the zombie infection. He begins to vomit blood and passes out. The next morning, he wakes up and walks outside to meet Etta, who urges him to look for Thumi's father, Willie, as he will look over Rosie. She then advises Andy to stay away from the Aboriginals, as they murder any zombies or infected who come near them. After the conversation, Andy heads out once again. On the way, Andy pauses at some ruins to give Rosie water. As he rushes out, he passes several zombies with their heads buried in the ground. One of them rises and starts pursuing him. Andy finds a car and tries to steal it, but is stopped by a guy named Vic, who protects him from the zombie who had been following him. Vic is stuck beneath a tank, and he hands up the car keys to Andy in exchange for a promise that he will save him first. Andy agrees right away, and after removing the weight that had been squeezing Vic, he starts the car. The two then rush into the car and race away, leaving the zombies behind. In the following scene, Vic drives Andy to his sanctuary, which was originally a gas plant outpost where he used to work. Lorraine, Vic's wife, is quietly surprised to meet Andy. Vic then instructs Andy to leave Rosie with Lorraine, so the two men can work together and hunt some food and kill some zombies. Vic believes that once the country is back to normal, people will crave money again. Thus, his job is killing groups of zombies and seizing their belongings. Vic baits the zombies by putting healthy live individuals in cages. Meanwhile, Andy notices Vic holding Thumi hostage inside a cage and gets irritated. Inside the shelter, while Lorraine is looking after Rosie and attempting to cheer her up, she discovers some yellow slime-like thing on her belly. Vic and Andy, on the other hand, move to a different cage. He uses organs, a radio, and blood to attract zombies, which makes Andy doubt himself for a bit. After the boys return to the shelter, Lorraine discusses cleaning up Rosie briefly. As Andy plays with his daughter before putting her in a temporary cradle, his hand starts to twitch. Seeing himself in this terrible condition and knowing that Rosie is in safe hands, Andy heads outside the shelter to a lonely place and tries to kill himself. But before he is able to do so, Lorraine confronts him and explains that she is not Vic's wife, and that Vic rescued himself by allowing her husband and other gas plant workers to die. As they are conversing, Vic appears out of nowhere and uses the butt of his rifle to knock Andy out. When Andy wakes up, he finds himself in the same cage as Thumi. Andy then asks Thumi to help him to get out of the cage. He devises a strategy in which he connects raw guts to a rope, attracting a swarm of zombies. When the zombies begin to tug on the rope, the door opens, allowing the two to flee. They safely return to the shelter and persuade Lorraine to come along with them. As they try to escape, Vic emerges and starts shooting at them. Lorraine shows herself and attempts to stop him, but it's too late, as Vic accidentally shoots her dead. Andy follows Thumi to the cage he saw before, but the man inside has vanished. They manage to avoid Vic's pursuit and spend the night in a tiny gorge. After freeing each other's chains, they sleep freely. Later at night, Thumi wakes up to heavy breathing and hides with Rosie as Andy rubs his face against blood on the wall. The next morning, Andy and Thumi have a talk regarding her father's well-being. After Andy points out that her father may never get well, Thumi storms away in anger. Just then, Thumi discovers her father straddling on the tree, dead. Andy arrives to console Thumi, but fails and swiftly departs. Soon he has another nervous breakdown after he finds out that he has very little time left before he completely transforms into a zombie. After some time, he attempts to bury his head in the earth, like other zombies. Thumi stands by the tree, heartbroken, but hears Rosie's cry and rushes to her aid. When Andy wakes up, he is surprised by Thumi, who has chosen to assist him in reaching the river. In the next scene, they travel by motorboat to the campground, where Andy last saw the family playing. They find an RV and investigate it, but find it empty. After that, Andy and Rosie search for the family, while Thumi stays behind. Andy finally meets the father, but finds out that he has been infected from a zombie attack. For the second time, the man shows Andy his loaded rifle. The man then reveals that there are 6 bullets in there, 2 of which Andy may retain after he uses the rest on himself and his family. Andy tries to persuade the man from finishing his family, but he fails. While Andy is leaving, 4 gunshots can be heard in the distance. He flinches at the sound of each of them. After the whole family is dead, Andy takes the gun and considers whether or not to shoot himself. As Andy is contemplating, Thumi appears out of nowhere, announcing that she is ready to return to her home. She also suggests that Andy follow her so that he can leave Rosie with the Aboriginals. Following this, they set out together to look for smoke coming from a nearby hill. As they pass through the train tunnel, Vic emerges in front of them. Thumi hides with Rosie inside a parked truck on the tracks as Andy attempts to distract Vic. Andy shoots rounds but misses each time as the 2 guys become more violent. Vic emerges from the shadows after the brawl and drags Thumi from the truck. He then knocks her head on the rails. While Thumi lies in agony, Vic grabs hold of Rosie. A limping Andy gets up to check on Thumi, who is still alive. He then finds Vic cradling with Rosie. He sits near Vic and demands his daughter back. At first, Vic refuses, but he ultimately returns the child while mourning Lorraine's untimely death. The trio then continue their journey. Continuing their way towards their destination, Andy begins to transform into a zombie. With very little time left, Andy begs Thumi to promise to look out for Rosie, with whom he exchanges a goodbye. Fearing that he might harm someone, Andy covers his mouth with a guard. He then starts securing his wrists and wraps the meat from earlier on a stick. Suddenly, his eyelashes are sealed shut and he passes out. Andy has now transformed into a zombie and all of his emotions have died. Despite this, he still carries the 2 children on his back as he is drawn in by the chunk of flesh on the stick. Eventually, they arrive at the Aboriginals' camp. The warriors seize Andy, while Thumi and Rosie are hailed by her mother. One of the warriors is about to strike Andy with his spear, but Thumi intervenes. She then takes Kay's perfume bottle and gives it one final spritz. Andy is briefly brought back to awareness by the aroma, which reminds him that Rosie is now in safe hands. Following that, Thumi ultimately allows the warrior to put Andy out of his misery. In the final scene, the Aboriginal people are shown traveling to a shelter where they are received warmly by several members of the tribe. Rosie is being examined by Thumi and her mother when they see the words "thank you" scrawled in white paint on her tummy. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.